Welcome to Foundations, a series of videos brought to you by the faculty of Memoria College. In each video of this series, we introduce one of the core texts in the Western Great Books tradition. Each of these texts are included in the core curriculum of the master's program at Memoria College. If you would like to join in our discussion, receive instruction from expert faculty, and join other like-minded students in live online classes, please visit us at memoriacollege.org. Martin, you teach a few classes for us. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, I'm Martin Cothran, and I teach our Introduction to Classical Education course. I do that about once a year, and then I also teach our Classical Pedagogy course. Both of those courses are usually in the summer, and then I have taught and will be teaching again my traditional logic texts for the college. And those are not regularly scheduled, but we do those occasionally. So those are the courses I teach.
I'm Dan Sheffler. I primarily teach our philosophy courses, and each year, my favorite course to teach is 601, The Education of a Free Man, in which we explore the theme of freedom throughout the Western tradition.
And I'm Kyle Janke, and I teach any number of literature courses and seminars at the college with a focus on American literature.
Today, we will be discussing the Apology of Plato. Martin, start us off here. Where does this fit into the history of the Western tradition?
Well, I think it's right at the fountainhead of philosophical thought, which is sort of ironic to me because in one sense it's the first truly philosophical text. I know we have the pre-Socratics and the thinkers in there trying to address some of those questions, but there's something different about Socrates. And one of the things that's different about Socrates is, in a sense, he's so modern. I mean, you read the Apology, and you're thinking, I totally understand this person. I'm on the same wavelength as this person. And the reason that I feel that way is because that has been passed on. That's the beginning of our tradition. And I feel like I have, when I read Socrates, that it's almost like a friend. It's somebody I completely understand, who I can relate to. And so he's really the first major thinker who thinks like us. And I think that's why it's such a great text to start with, in my opinion.
Kyle, you're our literature guy here, coming at what's traditionally taught in a philosophy class. What place do you think this has in the broader tradition?
I think just kind of going along with what Martin was saying, it wastes no time in opening and getting immediately to the point that we are putting the passions, human passions, in sort of in a cage, or within a boundary when we start off, and we're focusing in this text on reason and thought, and the efforts of the intellect moving in pursuit of the truth, which I think is really, that's in any literature book that I study with students, anything that I teach, that's what I want to be doing. It's an analysis of the passions, but it is also a intellectual, thoughtful pursuit of the truth.
It also strikes me that it's not an essay.
Yeah.
You read a lot of other philosophy in the history here, and it's this point by point, move through a structured argument. Throughout all of Plato's writing, he writes dialogues, but here in particular, it's not much of a dialogue. There's a little bit of back and forth with Miletus. But Socrates jumps off the page as a literary character, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that to get readers involved in that, just a simple fact of pointing that out to people initially when they start reading and saying, hey, look, we're on a certain character's side. Just like in any story, in any novel, you're put on the side of a protagonist. And that means certain things in terms of how you approach the text. Yeah.
And I'm blown away that no one has ever made a Hollywood movie of the trial and death of Socrates,
Yeah, I never
because
thought
it's
of
such a
that.
great story.
That's right.
Even
Yeah.
just again from a literary perspective, forget the philosophical ideas for one moment. The drama of it is a profoundly moving human drama.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think and it is a speech,
Mhm.
and there is a little uh, response from Miletus, no and yes mostly. But I think that we find ourselves. He's in an argument. He's on trial, and we find ourselves on his side
Mhm.
in a way that I mean, we do that in a novel too.
Mhm.
But we don't. You said it's not really an essay, and then that's the sense in which it's not an essay. Is that we're on his side? There's just two sides here, and we're hearing one of them. I wondered actually what was Miletus's case. I would have been interested to hear what he says against Socrates in addition to Socrates' defense. But the thing about it is he's a personality. You kind of said he's a character, but he's a personality. He's not just this is a philosophical text and it's treated as a philosophical text, but it's also very much a literary text in the sense that you do have a character here. So I agree with Kyle's point.
And we probably need to be somewhat careful here in approaching the character of Socrates, because the characterization is
Mhm.
given through the author Plato.
Mhm.
We also have Socrates mentioned by other historical authors, like Xenophon, for example. Aristophanes famously pillories him in the clouds. We have testimonia about Socrates from Aristotle. And those different portraits of Socrates differ a little bit from the one that we find here. So there is Plato the philosopher, but there's also Plato the playwright, who's, I think, somewhat coming up with a quasi-fictional version of Socrates. But this is the version of Socrates that sticks historically. How does that character have a kind of afterlife in the rest of the Western tradition?
Well, I mean, he's the one and most people are responding to for the next 2,000 to 2,400 years, whatever it is. And it's like, it's almost as if Socrates, the figure of Socrates haunts the rest of the tradition. He's the one that everybody needs to know. There's a lot of figures in philosophy. I took a philosophy degree. You took more philosophy degrees. And you see that. I mean, there's some sense in which every other thinker since him has to respond to him.
Yeah. Well, and just the literary legacy of that as well. That you read a Shakespeare play, and there's the same kind of deep intellectual thought and honesty about the human condition. I feel like a lot of what Socrates is doing is turning the turning sort of the accepted perspective on its head and showing the reverse side and saying, well, wait a minute, why do we all agree on this when this makes more sense? And I see Shakespeare doing that all the time in his plays. And I mean, just to fast forward into the modern age as well, I can't help thinking of, and we were talking about speeches, Atticus's speech in To Kill a Mockingbird it's a very similar, it's a, how should we say, not defeatist, but it's a speech he's not going to win. He's not going to convince, and he knows that he's not going to convince. So I mean, even there, in that modern of a text, you still have that legacy of, here's what it looks like to make the right argument, to be on the side of truth, even knowing it's going to fail.
As we send our students off to dive into this text and dig into the details here, what's one idea or theme or critical passage that they should be on the lookout for?
Well, the one that struck me, and I've read this numerous times, is and it happens near the end. I mean, all through this this dialogue, Socrates is basically standing up for the good, right? Because to he hasn't done what they've really accused him of doing, and he's responded to them. But but at the end, he kind of brings it down to one issue, and this is near the latter part of it. But he says, "But I suggest, gentlemen, that the difficulty is not so much to escape death. The real difficulty is to escape from doing wrong."
Mm.
In other words, he thinks it's better to be good and die than to be bad and live.
Mm-hmm.
And and again, that's just part of this whole dialogue in which you think, where did this come from? It's just like with the Greeks, this kind of thought it comes out of nowhere and poof, it's there in fully formed. Socrates is a fully formed philosopher. Where did he come from? Because the ones before him were not. We get the benefit of being after him, which I think is a good thing.
In the Gorgias, Socrates famously says that it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it.
Right.
It's better to be someone tortured by a tyrant than to be the tyrant that's doing the torturing.
Yes.
And that commitment to goodness and righteousness is staggering in this pagan Socrates in the middle of Athens, right here in 400 BC.
Right, and it's why so many Christians have looked back on Plato and considered him a kindred spirit. Now, obviously, he's not a Christian. Christianity doesn't even exist by this time, and there are some of his thoughts, which are his speculation. He doesn't have divine revelation in the way we have it. He does claim to have to sort of have heard God in a certain sense, and I think that as a Christian, you look at this dialogue and you think, I think he was. I think the God he's talking about is probably the one I worship. So.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
Well, sorry, I was just going to say to bring it down to a practical level as well, because I think often readers can read something like that and think, well, the next time I'm in a life-threatening situation, I'll have to remember that. But just what we were saying before, if we were just to tweak that quote a little bit, it's or what you had said, Martin, that it's better to be good and to fail also, right, than to be bad and succeed. So if we just talk about, not necessarily death, but if we just talk about failure, I mean, what a beautiful virtue to live by, that it's okay to fail as long as you're on the side of truth.
Well, and Chesterton will go a little further than that, and he'll say, nothing succeeds like failure, referring to the crucifixion. Right?
Yeah.
Well, this bleeds over to the theme that I wanted to point out for students to look out for. Socrates is often held up by Enlightenment thinkers or secular humanists as a kind of champion of free thinking, independent from religion. He's this person who ushers in an age in Greece of reasoning and challenging traditional religion. But I found it striking throughout the Apology just how much Socrates is appealing to religious ideas. He's appealing to the oracle at Apollo, or the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. He's appealing famously to his daimonion, which is something like a guardian angel for him. And he's being accused simultaneously of atheism and of inventing new gods. The whole trial, in fact, is a religious trial. And Socrates points out the incoherence of those accusations here in the Apology, because he very clearly is not an atheist. He's very clearly appealing to some sort of higher source of truth and a very real sense of religious conviction.
Yeah, and his whole case depends on that. And I when I was reading it, I'm thinking, who are these boneheaded jurors who convict him? I mean, because and that's why I said earlier, I wished I could see the other side, the other side's case, because he clearly is not an atheist. It's the clearest thing in the dialogue, and yet he gets convicted. And and I'm thinking, well, politics is probably like it is today, and we don't really judge on the basis of the true and the good and the beautiful. We judge on the basis of what's in somebody's best interest.
Sure. Well, how many of us have read Genesis? and thought, well, if I was standing in front of the tree, I would have done differently, right? What is Eve thinking? What is Adam thinking? I think that's just some of that is just the way that the world has always been and will always be.
Mm.
Yeah. No, just to back up your point, I think what I would say students should or readers should particularly look for um, is there's much less the sort of the rebellion of the bohemian in Socrates, and much more of just the faithful servant to truth. And there's a boldness that comes along with that. I mean, I'm always struck by the method he uses to I think is when he's giving his defense against the charge of corrupting the youth of Athens, where he's willing to sort of set out on a series of question and answers, anticipating what answers he's going to get and anticipating how to move toward the conclusion he wants to come to. And that's a method of teaching I think we're all really familiar with, right? But there's a boldness to it. There's a willingness to let, again, back to the willingness to fail. There's a willingness to let the truth come out on its own from that method, rather than to have some stranglehold on the point you want to make and force on your audience. To let the truth be known. And again, that boldness comes from, I think, an attitude of the servant, that Socrates is not trying to make himself heard primarily. He's primarily trying to make the truth heard. And that dictates everything that he's doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
So what point would you send the students off to look for?
Just that scene, that the method. So, and readers, when we say students, I'm thinking more. I love to be instructed as a teacher from the literature that I read. I think it's the best way to learn how to teach is to pay attention to the great books and how they instruct, and then to model that kind of. So that passage where he leads Meletus through that line of reasoning, his willingness to sit back and wait for the truth to come out. That's the thing that as a teacher, I try to discipline myself to do in the classroom, rather than to tell students like, hey, this is what you need to know. And sometimes I find I have to do that, but rather than tell them that, just to let the truth, let the text teach itself as I'm teaching it, and be a servant to the truth in the text, and be a guide to it. So to that passage, I think when he's exercising or following that method with Meletus, I think students should pay particular attention to that.
Absolutely. Well, we hope that this brief discussion has whet your appetite to go and read closely and carefully the Apology of Plato for yourself. It can be found in the Great Books of the Western World series that we use at Memoria College, published by the Encyclopedia of Britannica, and in many translations. And again, if you would like to join our faculty and our fantastic students and other like-minded people in live discussions on texts like this, please join us in our master's program at memoriacollege.org.